as we're all filtering in. But welcome. This is the last of 4 webinars in Women's Advocate's September webinar series. If you've attended any webinars with us in the past, this slide is going to look pretty familiar to you. We like to begin webinars by taking a collective breath. So just everybody take a deep breath in and gather yourself. And exhale. I love that little graphic, the box breathing graphic, because it does help with that. And I think it's important that we all sort of center ourselves in this space. It's the evening, so we are all coming from different parts of our day. If you're in Central Time, at least, we are all coming in from different parts of our day, and it's important to kind of get settled and get in the space together. I also want to remind everybody that we are going to talk about stalking today, and that's traumatic. Anybody experiencing or who has experienced something traumatic like domestic violence or stalking might be differently impacted by this content than folks who haven't had those experiences. So if you are somebody who might be affected or triggered by this particular content, I would encourage you to just do what you need to do to take care of yourselves. Just take a break, step away if you need to, anything is fine. I also want to name that all violence is interconnected, and police violence against Black and Indigenous people of color needs to be a part of these conversations as well. When we're talking about domestic violence, we need to be talking about the longstanding impacts of racism. We need to understand how community trauma can impact the Black and Indigenous survivors of color that we serve, especially those who've experienced police violence. I think it's important to hold space tonight, especially as we read more and more about the injustice in Louisville and the charges that were not levied against the 3 officers who killed Breonna Taylor in her sleep. As we talk about justice and safety today, we need to hold Breonna's name in our hearts and think about a future that is safer and more just for everybody. Let's see. Lastly, there are going to be a couple of polls tonight, so you can engage more with the content. We'll be self-reporting our current knowledge and just learning a little bit about each other through the polls. And with that, let's get started. So yeah, for the next 90 minutes, we are going to be talking about stalking. We'll be talking about the warning signs, what it is, who experiences it, who perpetrates it, the impacts and legal options of stalking, some considerations for the COVID-19 pandemic and stalking, and we'll go over some safety planning resources as well. Feel free to use the chat box to add any comments or responses. Use the Q&A feature to ask any questions. We have Amy Eisenor, who is on staff with a staff attorney from Standpoint. She is going to be answering the legal questions tonight. So if you do have a specific legal question, go ahead and privately message Amy or message all panelists, and we'll do what we can to give you advice. Amy is a staff attorney, so she is qualified for that, but just keep it specific, I guess. Amy, do you have anything to add about what sorts of questions you can answer tonight?
I am only licensed in the state of Minnesota, so I see that a lot of you are from across the country. So I can answer general questions about the federal law, which Minnesota's law is based on, but I can only answer questions where I'm licensed, which is Minnesota, so just keep that in mind. I am happy to answer them on the chat or the Q&A, and I'm gonna be taking myself off video so it's not distracting as I type answers to y'all.
All right, thank you so much, Amy. All right, now, so a bit of background about Women's Advocates and Standpoint. My name is Mary Beth. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a crisis and resource advocate at Women's Advocates. We are the first domestic violence shelter in the country, and we are located in St. Paul, Minnesota. Over the last 45 years, we have learned a lot about domestic violence, and we have expanded our services to include 3 Victorian homes in St. Paul that are all interconnected by links. We provide prevention and education services to the community. We provide shelter to up to 50 women and children on any given night. And we have a housing program that helps survivors maintain safe, sustainable, and affordable housing for themselves and for their kids. If you would like to learn anything more about women's advocates, you can go to our website, check out our YouTube channel. And now I will invite Tracy to introduce herself and talk about what she does at Standpoint.
Thanks, Mary Beth. It is great to see so many people on this webinar tonight from just all over the country and the world. It's great. So my name is Tracy Thomas-Card. I'm the Advocate Support and Grant Manager at Standpoint. I've been working in domestic and sexual violence advocacy since 2004. So I've done both direct service work, prevention work, and then I'm also certified as a Title IX coordinator. Like Mary Beth, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Standpoint. So our mission is to promote justice for domestic and sexual violence victims. And we have a unique model where we have a team of advocates and attorneys who all specialize in different areas of the law and in advocacy. And so our primary services are provided through our toll-free action line and text service. So folks throughout Minnesota are welcome to call. We also get out-of-state calls once in a while to receive technical assistance around legal issues as they relate to domestic and sexual violence, of course, which we include stalking, trafficking, and other forms of violence within that. And so our attorneys and advocates often provide this technical assistance and training to victim survivors, as well as to their advocates and their attorneys and other professionals who are working with them. Standpoint has been around since 1996, and we serve the entire state of Minnesota.
Thank you so much, Tracy. I am so excited to have you here. Now that we've introduced ourselves, we would love to learn a little bit more about you and your role in the community. I'm going to launch a poll here. Go ahead and just put down what your community role is, what you do. If you're not seeing your particular position listed in the survey, please put it in the chat. We just love to see where everybody is coming from and what our different levels of experience and exposure are. Oh, we have a couple of interns, a couple of students. I'll end the poll here in just a couple more seconds. All right. Let's see here. All right, and now I'm going to share the results of the poll. It looks like the majority of folks are domestic and sexual violence advocates, but we also have a good smattering of students and mental health case managers. All right, so we've got a good group of folks, a good mix. All right, so let's get into our actual content here. We're going to talk about definitions. First, domestic violence. There are a lot of different terms for domestic violence, and if you're an advocate, you probably already know most of them. It can be called relationship violence, intimate partner violence, family violence. But I wanted to include this specific definition so we're all on the same page about what we mean in this webinar when we say domestic violence. Our definition isn't necessarily the legal definition to qualify for a protective order, but it is a definition that really helps us understand the different tactics that are used in an abusive relationship. And it establishes, this definition does, that the goal of domestic violence is to gain power and control over another person. The component that makes domestic violence different from violence from a stranger is that close, intimate relationship. The fact that this violence and pain is being caused by somebody the victim knows, someone who claims that they love and care about you, whether that is a former partner, a spouse, a parent, a grandparent, uncle, aunt, roommate, somebody you live with, it adds a layer of complexity. Perpetrators of domestic violence have a unique power to hurt their victims in ways that a stranger never could. Domestic violence is often called the silent killer or the hidden epidemic or a private struggle or just family problems. And it's highly stigmatized. People are afraid to talk about what they see as private matters, which isolates victims further and makes domestic violence harder to eradicate. I include the definition of sexual violence here as well, because it's important for us to realize that the two are linked. Domestic violence and sexual violence are often siloed, they're often isolated from one another and viewed as separate issues. And as Christine says in the chat, it's a social problem. And to be good at our jobs as advocates, we have to acknowledge the overlap between domestic and sexual violence. Victims of domestic violence often experience sexual violence as a result or as a part of their victimization and vice versa. And as Christine says, it is a social problem because domestic and sexual violence are maintained by societal and cultural attitudes, institutions, and laws which are not consistent in naming this violence as wrong. All right.
All right, thanks, Mary Beth. So we're also going to go over just a definition of stalking by the U.S. Department of Justice so that we're all on the same page with that definition. I will point out a couple of things about this definition that I think is maybe missing, right? So they define the term stalking as engaging in a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to fear for his or her safety or the safety of others or suffer substantial emotional distress. And so that's the overall federal definition. We'll get into more specifics around the Minnesota statute around stalking and harassment a little bit later. But I just want to point out that, one, the definition used by the U.S. Department of Justice is still very gendered in nature, and so does not consider other identities that are not represented here. I do also want to point out that there's still a lot of myths about what stalking looks like. And so a lot of folks in general society, if they're not familiar with stalking, really do talk about it as though it's that stranger that's following you, right? And so it's more of a physical intimation that people have about stalking. And stalking can be both in person and virtual. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I know we do have a poll here that Mary Beth and I want to do to see if you'd be able to describe your current knowledge of stalking.
All right, and I have that poll going now. All right, so it looks like we've got, most folks know the basic definition of stalking, but in terms of anything deeper or specific, or in terms of actually working with stalking victims, there's a little bit of a gap. We do have some folks who are new to stalking, so that'll be interesting as well.
Great, well, hopefully we can get everyone's questions answered throughout the evening, so feel free to type them in the chat as we continue to go on with the presentation here. All right, so like Mary Beth mentioned, ultimately, like other forms of violence, stalking is used as a form of power and control over a victim. And so what's on this particular slide simply lists some examples of how stalking might be connected to victimization with regards to sexual violence and domestic violence. And so we know that victims of sexual violence are often groomed. So stalking behaviors related to sexual violence might be things like voyeurism or surveillance or information gathering about a victim. With intimate partner violence stalking, We know that stalkers tend to be more likely to physically approach the victim, more likely to potentially use a weapon in a situation, and that behaviors are more likely to escalate quickly. Now, all of this being said, there are victims of sexual violence and victims of domestic violence who may not experience stalking. But those that do often describe these sorts of behaviors as a connection to the other forms of violence that they're experiencing.
All right, thank you, Tracy. So here are some statistics related to stalking. Depending on your knowledge level and experience with stalking, you may have seen some of these statistics before, but they show just how prevalent stalking is in the United States. Even though it may not get as much attention or advocacy as other types of violent crime, stalking is experienced by a huge portion of the population, by 1 in 6 US women and 1 in 19 US men. And it's important to note that cisgender people are not the only ones who experience stalking. Transgender individuals of all genders experience stalking. 16% of trans people, in fact, reported being stalked by an intimate partner. Trans folks often experience stalking in the context of a domestic relationship, just like cisgender people, but often that stalking is occurring because of their status as transgender. People ages 18 to 24 are the most likely to experience the highest rate of stalking victimization. And in America, people who have been stalked are at least 200 times more likely to be murdered than Americans who are not stalked. The true statistic is likely much higher. There are a lot of that goes unreported. And also the most common tactic experienced by both male and female victims of stalking was repeated unwanted telephone calls, voicemails, or text messages. So not that stranger in the bush watching you or taking pictures, but the repeated contact. There's also a link here to a webinar about protective orders from Standpoint. Tracy, I don't know if you want to talk about that or not, but
Sure,
it is there for you.
Yeah, I can briefly describe it. Standpoint has a webinar series that you can find on YouTube, and so we'll often recommend this when folks are calling about various legal topics. Oh, like check out our webinar on this on YouTube. And so we have, it's about an hour and a half long, this webinar that really delves deeply into orders for protection as it relates to the law here in Minnesota. So feel free to check that out and call us with any questions that you might have about that. All right, so given the significance of the statistics that Mary Beth talked about, we wanted to talk a little bit about the various impacts that stalking might have on victims. And so we know that relocation is a huge issue faced by victims of stalking. 1 in 7 stalking victims are forced to move as a result of the stalking that they're experiencing. We also know that loss of work time is an impact. We know that 1 in 8 stalking victims report losing work time because of the stalking, and that more than half have lost 5 or more days of work. We know things like depression, anxiety, and insomnia are commonly experienced by victims of stalking. In fact, they suffer much higher rates of these particular issues than do the general population. We know that 86% of victims have reported that their personalities have changed as a result of being stalked. I can tell you from my experience in direct services working with victims of stalking, even after the stalking may have ended on the part of the person doing the stalking, they find that they make changes to their personality or lifestyle as a way to cope with what they've experienced. We know that 37% of all stalking victims fulfill the diagnostic criteria for having PTSD. And unfortunately, we know that suicidal ideation is also very common among stalking victims. In fact, 1 in 4 stalking victims contemplate suicide. And I think Mary Beth will do a poll and then some more statistics too.
Yes, I'm going to launch a poll here, just assessing sort of where we are as a group here. Have you ever worked with anybody or experienced or encountered someone who has experienced stalking? this can be somebody, a client that you've worked with, or maybe somebody you know. I just kind of want to get a feeling for how prevalent that is to folks in this group. Because as Tracy mentioned, it is something that just takes over a person's entire life almost. Stalking is really insidious in that way. So I'm going to end the poll here. It looks like we have a lot of folks who have worked with clients experiencing stalking. I don't know if this means necessarily that you've helped folks file a protective order or been addressing the stalking directly as you've worked with or encountered people who are stalking victims, but at least we sort of have an understanding of how that works and how that affects people. Another important thing to note is the prevalence of stalking in domestic relationships and among domestic violence survivors. 3 out of 4 victims of stalking know their stalkers, and the most common relationship between a stalker and the victim of the stalking is a current or former partner. So we may not always think of stalking as related to domestic violence, but it is. And in these cases, stalking is a tactic of domestic violence. It's a way for abusers to maintain power and control over a victim. And lastly, there's a gap in legislative response to stalking. Legislation hasn't quite caught up with the behaviors. Stalking is a crime in all 50 states, but less than 1/3 of the states classify it as a felony if it's the first offense, which leaves stalking victims without the protections that are afforded to victims of other violent crimes. So a lot of times, yeah, folks who have been stalked are not able to receive that sort of courtroom justice that other victims of violent crime may be able to receive. Also important to note is that nearly 54% of female victims and 41% of male victims of stalking have been stalked before the age of 25. So this is really, it's stalking of minors, and stalking of young people is something that's very common. As Tracy mentioned, there's often that emotional grooming that occurs with young people who are susceptible to stalking. And let's move on here.
Sure. So unfortunately, in part due to the lack of protections in the law that Mary Beth mentioned, we know that there's a big connection between stalking and femicide. This particular slide is only going to discuss femicide. Unfortunately, the research nationwide is still very much focused on women who experience stalking versus folks who may identify with other genders. So while we need that research, this particular slide focuses on femicide. We can safely assume that this is an impact that all victims of stalking are experiencing. So we know that prior stalking attempts are very common. People are often stalked prior to the femicide or the homicide occurring. 76% of women who were murdered by an intimate partner were stalked before then. We also know that it's common for victims to experience prior physical assaults. So going back to our discussions about the interconnection between domestic and sexual violence and stalking, we know that 89% of femicide victims who had been physically assaulted before their murder were also stalked in the year prior to their murder. We know that although folks are reporting stalking incidents, again, there is a lack of protection to victims in our society who are experiencing stalking. 54% of femicide victims had reported stalking to the police before they were killed. And then homicide attempts. We know that it's very common for multiple homicide attempts to happen. 85% of women who survived murder attempts were stalked. And then Mary Beth, if you want to move on, we'll talk about some of the warning signs.
Absolutely, and I'd like to launch a poll here as well to, oh, I'm sorry, I've been sharing poll results this whole time. I wanted to do a poll just to see some warning signs of stalking that we have up here. I wanted to know if any of you or clients you've worked with have experienced any or all of these warning signs of stalking. So I guess as folks are answering the poll, Tracy, would you like to just provide a little more detail about each of these? And then we'll see where folks end up.
Absolutely. So just quickly running through the various warning signs on this slide and noting too that there might be other warning signs we don't have listed here, but we know that sometimes it's a common behavior of stalking to try and contact the victim constantly, whether that's in-person contact or contact through social media or email or other means. We know that stalkers oftentimes will obtain details about the person prior to them providing them. I was just reading an article where somebody had discovered that their home address was out there. It was very public on the internet, and they had people sending them unwanted gifts. I see that somebody put in the chat, receiving countless threats to kill family members in gruesome and brutal ways, driving by their house to check in on them. Absolutely, those are all signs of potentially being stalked. Monitoring a person excessively, showing up unannounced or lurking around your workplace or neighborhood or schools. I see somebody put in the chat, monitoring someone's responses to Facebook event invitations and coincidentally showing up there, creating fake dating profiles with the victim's info. I will add to that. Thank you for putting that in there. I will add to that. We often see people creating fake social media profiles to track their victims. Things like wanting to rescue a victim or manipulating a victim into interacting with them in some way. I see using random numbers from different apps. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk into safety planning. I know people who have been tracked using the GPS on their phone systems. Many of us have Google Maps on our phones, and it has a lovely history timeline that shows where you've been and what time you've been and what date you've been. And so people may not, be aware of those things. And those are things that stalkers can absolutely use as tactics to track their victims.
Mm-hmm. All right, as we end polling, it looks like constantly contacting you is the one that most folks have experience with. And that does track because we were talking in the earlier slides about how that was the warning sign that was most commonly experienced by victims of stalking of all genders. Right. Yeah, there are a lot of just very creative ways that a person can stalk someone else, especially that spoofing of phone numbers and creating different social media profiles. It seems like as technology evolves, stalking behaviors really evolve with it.
Thanks, Mary Beth. Do you want to do the poll first?
Oh, yes. And now let's talk stalking tactics. Which of the following or which of these are most concerning to you? Maybe just in your personal life, but also tactics that are most concerning for you with regards to the people that you're serving. We have surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, interference, or something else. If there's a stalking tactic that is more concerning to you than any of these four, please put it in the chat, and we'll talk about it.
And as we're waiting for folks to complete the poll, I'll just say, I think it's important to consider these tactics because the safety planning that we'll do with victims who are experiencing stalking may look different depending on the tactics that their stalkers are using.
Yeah, about that individualized care that good safety planning has. Love that. All right, so I'm going to end the poll here. It looks like folks are kind of evenly concerned about all of these, but interference or life interference or sabotage are the ones that are of particular concern. So we can spend a little bit more time on that if you'd like. But yeah, Tracy, go ahead and let's talk about tactics.
Yeah, and I do also see, Mary Beth, somebody had marked in the chat, law enforcement not arriving to intervene before an attack. Yes, that's so very true. In fact, I had a caller the other day who was talking with us about that very situation, that sometimes it seems like victims are being told they have to wait until there's something physical that happens for law enforcement to intervene. And so we'll talk a little bit later in this presentation about ways that we can help the victims that we're working with document incidents of stalking and harassment, so that that can be used when they call to make a report in various violent incidents. So some of the stalking tactics that we talked about are under the categories of surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, and interference. Surveillance, fairly obvious, following or showing up at different places, watching or waiting for a victim. Life invasion, that's the things that we talked about, like unwanted contact, harassing others, public humiliation. Oftentimes it means contacting family or friends or the workplace of the victim. Intimidation tactics are often used, so threats from the victim or from themselves or others. Property damage, forced confrontation, so showing up at somebody's house or workplace where they don't maybe have an option to leave. I see somebody marked in the chat, even with physicality, please have a bias towards LGBTQ plus couples, thinking, oh, it's just two men or two women fighting, when in reality there's intimate partner violence occurring too. Yes, absolutely. And then I think with seeing with the interference, sabotage, or attack, which most people in the poll had checked that that was a significant concern, absolutely the financial or the work sabotage. So isolating somebody to the point where they feel like they might have to leave their workplace, or where their workplace is not supportive and they potentially can get fired for what they're experiencing. Attacking the victim or others. And then keeping folks from leaving, or custody interference is another common tactic that we'll see. Mary Beth, do we want to move on to some of the virtual and physical tactics?
Sure, let's go for it.
Sure. So there's a lot of different tactics that stalkers use. I'm just going to talk about a few of the more common ones that we see, whether or not it's virtual or physical stalking. So we've talked about the repeated unwelcome contact that can come in many forms. It can come in the form of texts or calls or emails or letters, but it can also come in the form of unwanted gifts being sent to a home or a workplace or a school. Physically following or spying on somebody is something that can be done both physically as well as virtually. I did a presentation around technology abuse last year, and one of the examples that was shared was a stalker had popped a GPS tracker into the victim's car, but it was in the back seat. And so the victim was never aware that that tracker was there. And so unfortunately, the stalker was able to track that victim's every whereabouts until they were finally able to run a diagnostic scan on the car and figure out, oh, there's a tracking system in here. And so stalkers use a variety of different tactics, and they're not always very visible tactics. It could also mean showing up to where the person is without a legitimate reason to be there, looking through your property, so looking through trash cans or mail, or getting into the car and looking around the car at things that might be that they might be able to gather information from. We see tactics like stealing or damaging property, threats to hurt you or your family or your friends or your pets. I always like to include pets in there, because we know that for victims of sexual and domestic violence, that's one of the barriers that keeps folks from reporting or leaving. And that's same with stalking situations. It could be information gathering. And again, that can be done physically or virtually. It could be collecting information through public record. It could be going on simple things like Google and seeing what information is available. I remember learning about Google Street View a while back, and how terrifying that was, that I could actually type in an address and I could see that person's house. I could see the car that they drove and their license plate number. And there are ways to block that information, but again, that puts the onus on the victim versus holding the person who's stalking accountable, right?
Tracy, there's a question. Is that a free service, or is there a service in general to have a mechanic look for that GPS tracker?
That's
or for anybody to look for a GPS tracker, really?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Amy actually typed the answer in. Yeah, law enforcement is able to do a sweep. Mechanic, it might be a case-by-case basis. And I will say it also too may depend on the county and their capacity to be able to do that. But the technology is out there to be able to do the sweeps. So yes. Thank you for asking that.
Thank you.
I think I covered most of the information on that slide.
Okay.
Yeah, so we could just go on to the next one, Mary Beth, if you'd like.
All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about responding to victims of stalking. Since most of us are domestic and sexual violence advocates, and a good portion of us are folks who have worked with victimized populations in some capacity. It can be really tricky sometimes to determine how to engage with people who have been or are being stalked, but it is just so important and crucial, especially in this field, to start by believing. If you're working with a client who shares with you that they think or they know that someone is watching, following, or monitoring or threatening them, believe them. Stalking can be really difficult to prove sometimes, and victims often fear that no one will believe them, or that people will think they're crazy or unstable. So it's important as advocates to alleviate this fear, to simply say, I believe you. When someone discloses to you that they think they're being stalked or that they know they're being stalked, thank them for trusting you with that information. It's really scary to disclose that, especially in a society that doesn't necessarily believe victims. So remind them that they are brave to share this with you. It's important to know stalking is a crime, and it can be traumatic to experience. We live in a victim-blaming culture where people who have experienced assault or violent crimes are usually berated for somehow causing or deserving what happened to them. So if someone tells you they're being stalked, remind them that it's not their fault, that they don't deserve to fear for their safety, that the person at fault here is the stalker. And finally, stalking looks different for everybody. The duration, intensity, and frequency of the stalking vary based on who the victim and the perpetrator are. There's no set mold to fill. So it's important to validate each person's experience of stalking, even if it's different from other stalking experiences you may have worked with or had. Amanda has a question in the chat about private investigators and why they might be, they might not be considered stalkers. I don't know, Tracy or Amy, if either of you have information on that, because it does seem like they follow, their whole job is to follow people and to have information on people's whereabouts. So why is that not stalking?
Having never looked into this, my guess would be that stalking is defined as doing it for the purpose of or creating harm of physical, substantial physical harm or substantial emotional harm due to fear of substantial physical harm. And a private investigator is gathering information about you. They're not doing it to harm you, or to physically harm you. And so they also are specifically licensed to do that. And just like law enforcement, they're given some parameters in which they're allowed to do their job. I don't like it, and I agree. I don't know why. That should be maybe. But then on the other hand, if we need somebody to investigate the perpetrator, we want them to be able to gather the information too. So that would be my off the cuff, not very helpful answer.
Thank you, Amy. It does really just go back to that definition, which is a little bit wavy at times, but that, yeah, that intent to cause fear, I think probably has something to do with it. Again, I didn't go to school for that. So I thank you for doing your best at answering that for us, Amy. Yeah, just when we're working with victims who are being stalked, just believe them, tell them you believe them, tell them that it's not their fault, and thank them for the trust that they've placed in you by disclosing their victimization, because experiencing stalking can be incredibly isolating, especially in a culture that doesn't talk about those things, that doesn't reward survivors for coming forward and sharing their experiences. So it's important to approach victims of stalking with an attitude of trust and thanks. All right, and we'll talk more now about stalking and domestic violence. They're deeply interconnected. We've just talked about this, and we've already touched on the fact that 3 out of 4 victims of stalking know they're stalkers. And that the most common relationship between a victim and perpetrator is a current or former partner. When someone's being stalked, that's often an indicator that they're experiencing other forms of violence as well, that other forms of violence might be afoot in that person's life. 81% of women who were stalked by a current or former spouse or cohabitating partner were also physically assaulted by that partner. And 31% were also sexually assaulted by that same partner. So this is where we see really the intersections of those 3: domestic violence, sexual violence, and stalking. They're not the silos that we oftentimes put them in. They're deeply interconnected. Stalking is terrifying and intimidating and isolating, and abusers stalk their victims to assert power and control and to undercut their victims' sense of freedom and agency and safety. Victim survivors who have recently fled an abusive relationship are very likely to be stalked by the abuser. So when you're working with victim survivors of domestic violence, it's really important to safety plan and to include the possibility of stalking in their safety plan. We will talk a little bit more about safety planning with survivors later in the webinar, but it is really important to mention that now, that as somebody is fleeing a domestic or fleeing an abusive relationship, they could be really vulnerable to stalking. We know that the most fraught or the riskiest time for a victim survivor is when they're leaving the relationship. That's often when the lethality risk goes up, and there's a more likely possibility that that they'll be physically harmed or even killed by their abuser. And it's important to factor in stalking to that as well. Leaving is a really dangerous time, and so safety planning for all possibilities is super important.
All right, so we'll talk a little bit now about the implications of COVID-19 on stalking victims. We've talked already about how stalking victims oftentimes will use technology as a tactic to stalk their victims. But with the shelter-in-place orders happening in many states across the country and in the world, we know that stalkers have increased opportunities to monitor their victims and to isolate their victims during this time. But probably one of the bigger impacts that we've seen in Minnesota, and I can only imagine in other states as well, is the delays in the criminal justice system. So we know that many courthouses were shut down for a number of months. In Minnesota, we are starting to reopen our courts slowly, but that led to delays in survivors being able to access resources and to file applications and to have those applications approved. Survivors oftentimes weren't able to get into a courthouse, and so we had to figure out, as advocacy here, how do we help victim survivors who choose to file for harassment restraining order and order for protection? How do we get that filed and get that signed and get that granted so that that survivor can start to feel some measure of relief? And if we want to go to the next slide, Mary Beth, we'll just talk a little bit more. So we know also COVID has left survivors more isolated and vulnerable. They might be lacking access to not only criminal justice resources, but advocacy resources or other sources of support in their community. We know that they may be isolated at home with the person who is causing them harm. We also know that abusers are using COVID-19 specific control tactics to escalate their abuse. We know that some crisis hotlines initially were reporting declines in calls, and now we're seeing the uptick, right? So as folks start to, I hate to say get used to our new norm, but get used to our new norm, we're finding that calls to hotlines around the world are increasing. And we want to always point out that hotline numbers don't necessarily tell the whole story. So although an increase may mean more survivors have access to being able to call the hotlines, a decrease doesn't necessarily mean that stalking is less of an issue. For some survivors, especially if they're isolated at home with the person who's causing them harm, or they know that the person who's causing them harm has in some way access to their emails or their phone calls that they make, they may not have access to have a way to call for help.
Right. And as for women's advocates, at least we saw that huge dip in calls and realized, oh my God, people are at home with their abusers. They can't call for help. So we added a live chat to our website to engage with folks directly online, because if you're in the room with your abuser, you could at the very least be texting with somebody. I think shelters are working around that or trying to make sure that technology is catching up to the need so that we can interact with survivors who are quarantined with their abusers. It's a really weird time.
And then too, we get into security issues with the technology that both we are using as advocacy, but also that the victim might be using. So is their mode of texting safe for them? Is it safe for them to send an email? Can their calls be tracked in some way? And so figuring out security issues around things like video conferencing or phone services to the survivors that we're working with is really important to consider as well.
Absolutely.
All right. Moving right along, we'll talk a little bit about the statute, and I do want to point out this is very specific to Minnesota. You can easily look up the statute in your own state, but in Minnesota, I want to point out that we use language like actor and victim, so taking the gender out of the statute. So in Minnesota, the statute is specifically to engage in conduct which the actor knows or has reason to know would cause the victim under circumstances to feel frightened, threatened, depressed, persecuted, intimidated, and causes this reaction on the part of the victim regardless of the relationship between the actor and the victim. So a lot of legal language there, but I think you'll see it very much reflects that federal definition that we looked at earlier. And then our statute goes on to talk about the various types of stalking and harassment that would fall under this. And so it could be stalking and harassment that is done directly or indirectly or through third parties that manifests and to injure a person, property, or rights of another. It could be things like following, monitoring, pursuing another person, whether that's in person or through any available technological or other means. So the statute has evolved to include those electronic methods of stalking. It could be returns to the property of another. So if the actor is without claim of right to the property or consent of one with the authority to consent. Could be repeated telephone calls, text messages, or inducing a victim to make telephone calls, whether or not a conversation ensues. Could be things like making or causing the telephone of another person to repeatedly or continuously ring. It could be repeatedly having mail or delivery, including electronically of letters, telegrams, messages, packages through assistive devices for people with vision impairments or hearing loss, or any communication that's made available of any other technologies or objects. Another type of stalking and harassment in the statute is knowingly making false allegations against a peace officer or using another's personal information without their consent to invite, encourage, or solicit a third party to engage in a sexual act with the person. And so under the Minnesota statute, there's three things that I'd like to focus on, and then I'm going to invite Amy to weigh in on anything that she has to add to this. In our statute, we have a no proof of specific intent required. So essentially, the state is not required to prove that the actor intended to cause the victim to feel frightened, threatened, oppressed, persecuted, or intimidated. We do have a specific discussion about venues in our statute. So if stalking is occurring in 2 or more counties, which as we know it often does, the accused may be prosecuted in any county where the acts were committed for all of the acts. And then firearms. We get a lot of questions at Standpoint regarding firearms and how that is connected to both the stalking statutes, but also domestic violence and sexual violence statutes. So in the stalking and harassment statute, it says the courts may prohibit a person convicted of stalking from possessing firearms. That being said, as I'm sure Amy can weigh in on, we know that there isn't a mechanism in place to actually go and take people's guns away. And so very often we'll have victims or advocates calling us to say, but isn't this prohibited? And yes, it may be prohibited by the courts, but unfortunately there's not that mechanism of enforcement. And so Amy, I'd like to just invite you to weigh in on anything here that you'd like to add, please.
I think you did a good job covering it. I think the only thing of interest is that last year our harassment statute was struck down as unconstitutional. They quickly, the legislature met quickly and rewrote it to make it constitutional. And so it is effective August 1st, our new statute went into place. Our stalking statute is really all under our harassment statute. It only becomes stalking if you're convicted of 2 or more harassments or violations of order for protection. So it's hard to find if you're looking for stalking. And it's also can be really helpful for advocates to remember that this statute exists and to point it out to law enforcement when they're refusing to come to non-physical incidences, non-physical abuse or sexual abuse, saying it's not criminal, we're not going to do anything about it. It is a crime. Violating an order for protection is also a crime. So then you have 2 crimes, which makes it enhanceable to stalking. And getting to stalking can go very quickly for a lot of our victims if the perpetrator is repeatedly contacting them. If you make 83 phone calls, you're up to stalking by the 3rd call. So remembering that this exists, getting it out to your law enforcement, if you're on teams with them, multidisciplinary teams and stuff together, just reminding them that this is an option and that it can help protect victims, and how lethality is closely connected with stalking. Anything else you wanted me to cover, Tracy?
Thanks, Amy. Whoops, okay.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. So I think it's really important as an advocate to talk about options, because as we know, that's our role as advocates, is to give the folks who approach us and access our services the options, and to allow them to decide what's best for them. And so the first option is to do nothing. So sometimes a survivor who's being stalked will choose not to do anything, not to report, not to disclose. They might not tell family or friends. They might not tell anyone. And that's a valid decision for some folks. Other times, a survivor might choose to try and file for a protective order with the intent of preventing future incidents. Whenever I am talking about protective orders with somebody, I always remind them that a protective order is one remedy, but it doesn't guarantee that the stalker will not continue contacting them. It's one strategy that we can use to try and prevent it from occurring in the future. Other times, the survivor may choose to connect with a community-based advocates. So advocates in Minnesota have privilege and have to maintain confidentiality under state laws. And so that allows us to be able to hold what victim survivors are telling us in confidentiality, unless they choose to release that information. And the great thing about working with an advocate is they can have that support to do a safety plan or to assist a victim with filing a protective order. It can be very overwhelming to figure out which form to file and what documentation you need to have and where you go and file it and what happens in the follow-up. Or assisting with reporting to law enforcement if the victim chooses to do so. And then another option, obviously, is that survivors can choose to report stalking to law enforcement agencies. As we saw earlier in the statistics, over 50%, unfortunately, over 50% of femicide victims did choose to make a report. And so I'll leave it to all of you to decide how effective of an option that is right now, but it is an option that some survivors choose to go with. And if a survivor does choose to report, I always work with them to help them to document, like Amy was mentioning, the importance of documenting the dates of the incidents, the time, what happened, how it made that survivor feel, the impact on the survivor. So that when they do present that information to law enforcement, as an advocate, you can also help them to present that statute and potentially, hopefully, get law enforcement to take it much more seriously than they may otherwise. And again, the response by law enforcement really truly does depend on the officer and on the county and on the training that they receive. There are some amazing law enforcement officers who know that stalking very much can lead into an escalation of violence, and others who unfortunately don't understand that connection yet. So if we want to move on to some safety planning resources,
yes. Well, I think we've got protective orders first in the lineup here. That's what I've got on my screen, but
nope, I sure skipped a slide. Sorry.
Oh, okay, that's all right. I do have one question. Our last poll, I want to know if any of you have ever helped a client obtain a protective order. We did talk about protective orders earlier, and we're going to talk about protective orders for stalking specifically now. But there are different types. You can select multiple choice. We'd love to know if you've worked with clients on that process. I'm going to give it a couple more seconds here as we filter in. It looks like we have a good portion of folks who haven't helped a client obtain a protective order before. I will go ahead and share the poll results. That's mostly it is, we've got a webinar full of people who have not worked with protective orders, tied with an OFP for our most.
Mary Beth?
Yes.
I can't see your poll results.
Oh no. Let me share the results here. Hopefully that works.
There we go.
Okay, good. Yeah, this is where we've all landed as a webinar. It looks like most people haven't helped a client obtain a protective order, but there is a good number of people who have helped folks obtain an OFP. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing the poll, but Tracy, I'd invite you to talk about the different types of protective orders for stalking.
Sure. So, and we really have three types of protective orders that I want to cover here. And I'll just briefly go over the differences, and then I'm going to again invite Amy to weigh in. She is our residential expert on protective orders at Standpoint, and so she takes lots and lots of calls on our action line about questions regarding all three of these. So just very simply, for an order for protection, it is a family court order done by a household or family member, and it's done at the victim's request. So for an OFP, you have to allege physical harm, bodily injury, or assault, or infliction of fear and imminent harm, injury or assault, or terroristic threats, criminal sexual conduct, or interference with an emergency call in order to qualify for those. A harassment restraining court order is a civil court order. And so a lot of folks don't initially understand the differences. An OFP is very much something that you do through the family court, whereas HRO you do through civil court. And an HRO, to qualify for that, you need to have a single incident of physical or sexual assault, repeated incidents of intrusive or unwanted acts, words, gestures that have a substantial adverse effect or are intended to have a substantial adverse effect on the safety, security, or privacy of another. And again, that's done at the request of the victim. There does not have to be any special relationship. I did see that somebody put in the chat, is this for all states? This information specifically is Minnesota based, and Amy noted that most states do have something similar, but they might have different titles and different requirements. And then we also have something known as a domestic abuse no contact order, a DANCO. And that is something that is done in a criminal case where there are criminal charges pending and or a conviction for domestic abuse, harassment, or stalking when it's committed against a family or household member, when a violation of an order for protection or a violation of a prior DANCO order. And so something that a lot of folks don't know about DANCOs, and we often will get calls on this. A DANCO is actually a criminal order against a household or family member that is not requested by the victim. It is something that the prosecutor in the case has to request. So a victim on their own can request an HRO, they can request an OFP, they can request a DANCO, but it really has to come through the prosecutor. In Minnesota, we have something that's known as the guidance file. And so this is in part one response to and one strategy that we've used during the pandemic to help victims file for protective orders. And it's essentially an electronic system that allows victims to file these orders to the courts without actually going into the courthouse for the most part. Amy, I would love for you to weigh in on protective orders with your expertise.
I think you did a good job covering it. They are very simple forms to file and ask for, with very, very nuanced reasons. You may or may not ask for different things. Earlier on the slides, I saw the link to our OFP HRO webinar, which is on our Standpoint's YouTube channel. So I would encourage you to look at that, or if you have questions, call an attorney, particularly if children are involved. There's reasons you would not want to file an order for protection if you are a single mother and the father has no rights, even if you want protection for the kids, which is counterintuitive. So it's important to, we don't have time to go into all the nuances about this, which is why there's a whole 2-hour training on it. So feel free to look at that. And if you have specific questions, call our hotline, and I'm happy to answer questions for you regarding a specific client or petition.
Thank you, Amy.
All right, let's talk about safety planning then. As as we know, domestic violence victim survivors are often susceptible to stalking, and an important part of working with victim survivors is safety planning. Safety plans should be individualized. They should be unique to each person's unique lived experience and experience with victimization. They should be realistic and always open to being revised or revisited, and they should be shared. So when you're working with a survivor, there are a lot of different safety plan templates out there. We're going to show you a few of them in the next slide, but it's important to work with the survivor and figure out kind of which one makes sense for their situation and their needs. And ask the survivor if the safety plan would even be helpful for them. There are some folks who just don't need that kind of information or don't need that written down, but always leave it open for the possibility that they will come back and request to work through that. If they do say, yes, I would love to have a safety plan, you can show them the template you had in mind and work together to figure out which parts of it are helpful for them. This is all survivor-led, survivor-directed, so you give them the option and then leave it up to them after that. Survivors, particularly of domestic violence and stalking, have had a lot of their movements and agency monitored, have spent a lot of time under being told what to do. So when safety planning, it's really important to just give them that freedom of choice and the freedom to pick and choose what they do and don't want to engage with in a safety plan. If the survivor you're working with says, no, I don't think a safety plan is something I need right now or want, tell them how they can access those resources later. We don't close the door forever on somebody who doesn't want a safety plan in the moment, because things can change. So make sure they know how to access those resources if they do decide at another point to engage with safety planning. You can provide our crisis line number at Women's Advocates, or Google an interactive guide to safety planning. I've got a couple of other templates here on this slide, more examples of safety plans that you can find on our website. Good safety planning is holistic. It includes not just physical safety, but financial, mental, and emotional safety as well. Because domestic violence, sexual violence, and stalking affects all of those parts of a person's life, as well as just their physical safety. You can find larger copies of these safety plans on our Women's Advocates website, but these are just a couple that I like to use for folks. Emotional safety planning is really important, and it's important to have good safety plans that include that as well. In terms of specific safety plans for stalking, I will defer to you, Tracy, for all of those.
Thanks. So I think, I really appreciated, Mary Beth, that you mentioned the idea of safety planning being really holistic. And so I'm going to focus in the next couple of slides on physical stalking safety tips that we can give to survivors, and then also virtual stalking safety tips that we can do. But I think remembering those other pieces of a holistic self-care plan, the emotional safety planning, I think that is really crucial when we're working with victims. And so there's a laundry list of things that we can, of options that we can provide to victim survivors around physical stalking. I think it could be something as simple as you have a habit of turning on random lights in different parts of the home at different parts of the day, so that lights aren't an indication of when somebody is home versus when they're not. Many people will put signs for security systems or get security systems that are visible to the public. So a sign that is in your yard or your window. It could be things like, if the victim is comfortable with it, notifying Neighborhood Watch or a homeowners association or a landlord that there's a suspicious person around your home and your community. Sharing the make or model or license plate number of the stalker's vehicle if you have that information. so that people can be aware of and document maybe when that stalker is physically coming to your home or to your workplace. It could be, if folks are comfortable with it, asking coworkers to screen calls, asking roommates to screen calls, making sure that your bank and doctor's office have password protected your information and accounts so that they're not inadvertently giving information out to somebody who doesn't have access to it. It could be things like changing up the daily routine, maybe using a different bank or a different grocery store, taking a different route to work or to school, trying not to travel alone and staying in public areas as much as possible, developing a code word. I think that that can be used so that when a stalker is present, you can notify a trusted friend or a family member that you might be in danger and they can intervene. And again, I want to reiterate that even though we are giving the survivor these tips, it's up to them to choose what might work best for them. And that these tips, again, we're putting the onus on the victim to prevent stalking from happening to them. And while unfortunately, these are safety planning tips that many victim survivors will use, it isn't right ultimately, right? Ultimately, we want to say to a victim, you have every right to be in your home with all the lights on or none of the lights on anytime you want. But our culture just isn't there yet. And so, Mary Beth, if you want to move on to the online stalking safety planning tips. I know we had talked earlier, a lot of folks had questions about ways to potentially block phone numbers, things like that. So I'll talk a little bit more about safety planning tips that that victims can use to prevent stalkers. And I see that Amy put into the chat that she just talked to somebody who is requesting their protective order be modified to require that the stalker provide a description of his new car and license plate because he had bought a new one, so she wouldn't know that it was in him. So if there is already a protective order in place, potentially requesting a modification to put something like that in there so that people are aware. Thank you, Amy. That is a creative solution. So if we're switching back over and thinking about virtual stalking, it could be things like blocking that person's phone number, blocking them on social media. I always caution folks when using this option because the likelihood is that the stalker is going to get a new phone number and get a new social media account. And so there are advantages to not blocking as well, especially if we're trying to document various incidents of stalking. We may want to be aware, or the victim may want to be aware that that person is there and it's their account and they know that. So always trying to find both the pros and the cons in these tips, I think, is important. Another option is to contact the email provider to see if they can block an email address or to change a phone number and email address by creating new ones. Again, that kind of leads back into the same nuances that we talked about with blocking social media accounts. It will depend on the provider as to whether or not they will be able to permanently block an email address. So most email platforms these days will have an option where somebody can set up a special folder for emails from a stalker to go into or from somebody who's contacting them repeatedly. Most of them will have a system where they can block temporarily an account from getting through. That doesn't, though, mean that the stalker will not then create a new account that won't have those same filters, right? Other options, and this is something that I definitely always recommend, increasing internet security on all of the devices that a person has. And that really means all of the devices. I think when we sit down and truly think about all of the devices that are in our homes, in our cars, in our workspaces, it can come to be a big list. I know many people have, I always use Alexa as an example because I have Amazon Alexa. But I also have Amazon Echo and Amazon Dot. And so I have about 4 different Alexa devices in my home. And that's just in my home. That's not accounting for the app that's on my phone or the app that's on my laptop that also allows me to access those things. And we see stalkers using those same sorts of tactics. I think checking devices for spyware is also going to be really important. I see we have a question, how can we prevent spyware from being downloaded on devices? That is a really great question. So there are some devices that will allow you to set up security filters that will prevent current spyware from being downloaded. That being said, what we're learning is that spyware is being created. So I could give you a list of 100 different software programs that people use to make fake calls and fake accounts and to track people, and tomorrow we would have 100 more. So I think that's something to be aware of. Oftentimes we will have folks who are calling and saying, my information is being tracked. I think I have spyware on my phone. You can always encourage folks to go to their local law enforcement agencies, their local sheriff's office, to see if they would be able to do a dump on the phone or on the computer to see if there is spyware. But again, that doesn't prevent the new spyware from being uploaded. And so definitely making sure they're always, and it's a constant check. You're constantly checking the security of your devices and your networks, and you're using strong passwords and changing them regularly. You're regularly updating software. You're muting and blocking your camera. I think finding out what the laws are in your state around stalking via the use of technology is going to be really important for the victims that you're working with. And just knowing how easy it is, unfortunately, for stalkers to use technology to manipulate their victims. Last year when we were doing our presentations around technology abuse, there was a video that we would share with our audience where a stalker was able, because the person had a smart home, the person who was stalking them was able to access things like the temperature on their shower and the temperature in their home and the sound systems that they had in their home, or the lighting systems that they had in their home, and even, unfortunately, the security to be able to lock their home. And so really talking with victims that you're working with about what sort of technology they have that their stalker might have access to. Another random example that I like to bring up, check your pets. If you have GPS collars on your pets, those can also be used by stalkers. I see Amy mentioned children's devices, especially if it's going back and forth for parenting time, or even some of the toys that they have out that allow you to send messages to children via an app that you download. So there are a lot of different things to consider when you're considering safety planning around technology. I'm happy to answer any other questions. I know that was kind of a lot right there. We could talk all day about this, is my point, but there are a lot of different options that you can give the folks that you're working with. So speaking of the many ways that stalkers can use to manipulate their victims, we always recommend, if it's safe for the victim that you're working with, to keep a stalking incident log. And so this is a very basic template here. You can use whatever template works best for the victim that you're working with. There are some electronic logs out there. I am always hesitant in providing that option to victim survivors, because if you are using a computer that has been compromised to record what's happening in the stalking incident log, that could potentially damage the information that you're collecting. It could disappear one day, it could change. And so I think if it's safe, and if there's a safe place for a victim of stalking to store that incident log, keeping a paper copy, maybe keeping even multiple copies. Yes, we can absolutely share the log template, Megan, not a problem at all. And in fact, I think I have it linked here in the resources. But essentially what it does,
at the top of the PowerPoint slide as well. So when you get the PDF copy, you can download a link there too.
Yep, so you can just click on that link and grab it. But it helps you to be able to do things like document the date, the time, the description of the incident, where the incident happened. So various information like that. Sometimes people who are being stalked via text or phone calls, yes, Christine, it would also be possible to send the incident log to a trusted family member or a friend if you trust that that person can keep that information secure for the victim that you're working with. Absolutely. Sometimes victims will have been told that they need to get a call record from a cell phone company. I can tell you that it's rare and really going to depend on the cell phone company, how far back they track and whether or not they would actually be able to provide that information to somebody who's not an account holder. So there are ways to do it sometimes, unfortunately, is the answer to that, but there are many phone companies who hold that information private and who honestly don't keep a long-term access to a lot of records. So all of those things are things to keep in mind when we're talking with victims about keeping the stalking incident and behavior logs. So then we'll just transition really quickly into, I always like to, the preventionist in me is like, well, this all sucks. What can we do about this? So I always like to conclude with some recommendations, right? And first and foremost, I think if there's nothing else we have learned in this presentation, it's that the laws and in our society in general have not quite caught up to the needs of victim survivors of stalking. And so encouraging legislators to tighten the stalking statutes so that stalking is both easier to prosecute and classified as a more serious crime. Amy mentioned the changes that we had to our statutes this past year. Definitely a reason to call our legislators. Asking legislators to update the federal definitions of domestic violence to include stalking and dating violence and to prohibit stalkers and have a way to enforce the prohibition of firearms for folks who are committing seriously violent crimes against others. Asking congressmen to support legislation that would provide additional funding for local program initiatives, so local advocacy programs, counseling services for victims of stalking is really important too. The preventionist in me always goes back to education. So if we do not start educating people early on and often, this is going to continue to be a problem. Mary Beth mentioned early on in the presentation, we know most stalking incidences, the highest rate being reported are between the ages of 18 and 25, and many of those folks had reported stalking happening before they turned 18. So if we are not providing appropriate curriculums for elementary school students, for middle school students, for high school students, and then in college, we are not going to be able to prevent this violence from happening. Megan asked a good question. Would the logs be considered as evidence in a hearing? And Amy put in, yes, it could be considered evidence, absolutely. We also want to encourage our local schools and our youth programs to train teachers, school counselors, coaches to recognize the signs of children and youth who are in violent situations. You know, I can't tell you how many teachers and counselors and staff members at schools I've talked to who have said, well, we never received formal training on this. We don't know what to do if somebody is in this situation. And to this, I always add, can we please start training our bus drivers, our janitors, our dining service workers, people who are very frequently in positions where they will overhear or be told of, and they may not then have the mechanism to do anything about it. So the more training that we can provide, the more support programs in our community, I think the better off we will all be. Okay, Mary Beth, should we talk about some specific resources folks can access?
Absolutely, and here they are.
All right, so just real briefly, these will all be links that you can all click on once you have the PDF or the PowerPoint. If you're looking for good research, the Stalking Resource Center is always one of my go-tos. The CDC has some really great information on stalking. There's a link around technology facilitated stalking, and to that I think you know from my safety planning slide that we could talk in far more depth about different cyber stalking and technology resource websites. Women's law stalking and cyber stalking has some interesting resources on their pages. They do have a state-specific page. I will say though, when I clicked on Minnesota, they did not have updated information available. So if you're an advocate in Minnesota, call Standpoint and we'll give you the most up-to-date legal information around stalking in our state. There's safety tips for stalking victims, COVID-19 considerations, a link to some stalking incidents and behavior logs. So the one that we linked to earlier on is just one example. There are many different forms out there that you can use. And then similarly, a technology abuse log.
All right, and just as we're wrapping up, we have a lot of resources available for everybody. This is the link that you can use to download all of those safety resources. Some of them are specific to Minnesota, but some of them are also specific to women's advocates. Next, I want you to know we've got a live chat feature on our website. So if anybody you're working with is either quarantined with an abuser or unable to use the phone, please have them chat us. We can do safety planning and emotional support over the chat, as well as resource connections. We have a couple of upcoming events, and you can register for those online after this. And finally, we are going to have a survey as you close out of this. So feel free to fill that out. We'd love to know how you think we did. I'll put in instructions for how to get a certificate of attendance. You can just email outreach. If you have any last questions in the 4 or so minutes that we have remaining together, go ahead and put them in the chat. But Tracy and Amy, thank you so much for being with us tonight, and thank you to everybody who came in. But yeah, Tracy, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time. I am so glad we were able to talk about this today.
I am too, Mary Beth, and thank you. I mean, we really enjoy partnering with women's advocates on this, and anytime folks want training or technical assistance, we're happy to provide that.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much. I am going to stop recording now, and you can just